Hi, welcome to Moving to a New Place, a podcast about race, faith, and all things in between. My name is Mike Linnan. Also on this podcast, Dalton Holloway, future Nobel Peace Prize winner for his always prudent and humanitarian use of social media. His light alone can turn trolls into stone. On this podcast, we're talking and inquiring about the Indigenous Canadian perspective on race and faith. And so we reached out to Dr. Ray Aldred. Ray describes his heritage this way.
My mother was born on the banks of the Lesser Slave Lake in northern Alberta. And from her, I am Cree, from Treaty 8. Swan River Band is where she's from. And I'm living down here in Vancouver on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. So I'm trying to be a good guest down here. And I am the director of the Indigenous Studies program at the Vancouver School of Theology, and I'm the acting dean as well for a year.
But what Ray forgot to mention is that he's also been a pastor, also an overseer and help to First Nations churches. He's been a professor at Ambrose Seminary in Calgary. Aside from publications and numerous speaking engagements, he's also someone who's helped many so-called white evangelicals to follow Jesus beyond their often narrow margins of church and culture. That's including me. When you've watched this stuff that suddenly takes over the media, and you've been working in the area of like racial difference and the way people treat each other, historical grievances and real injustice for years, and all of a sudden everybody's talking about it and making pronouncements about it. What have been the things that stand out to you in the midst of all that?
One that it can quickly, I got a friend, Nestor Medina, who teaches New Testament down in the States. And maybe this might be part you want to edit out, but he always, we were speaking at an anti-race, we were talking about racism. We were both presenting papers at a conference at North Park. And it's published in a little journal. I remember him saying, and every time he gets up and speaks, he says, it's not just a black-white issue. And that sort of echoed in my mind, because quickly it devolves into African-American and white. That dominates the conversation. That's what happens in the United States, and that's happened here too. Even though it's more nuanced than that and more complicated than that.
Right.
And I mean, it's good that people are talking about it, but I don't know. I have a feeling of frustration, or a feeling of, I don't know if it's sadness, or I wonder, is something going to be missed? Maybe it's more complicated.
Right.
And I'm worried that, but maybe not. Maybe I shouldn't worry about it.
No, I think you should play it out. What do you what's the end if what you think is missing right now is missed?
Well, here's some of the things that are missing. Now I actually said this to Cameron Carter, who used to teach at Duke, African American. He wrote a book, Race, a Theological Account, which I think was his PhD thesis. And he does really good work, traces the roots of racism all the way back to the Gnostic movement.
Wow.
And points out that one of the only theologians to resist sort of race slavery is Irenaeus. But because the Christian Gnostics have these, if you read their stuff in Irenaeus's writing, they have these three levels of humanity: the really spiritual people, and the really kind of fleshly people, and then the ones that are sort of And if you think about it, and there was this arrogance, and you look down on others, which really racism is, you look down on other groups of people,
Yeah.
And so, but in responding to his book, so I read it, and Bernie Vanderwall, who you know, Mike,
Yep.
and he set this thing up at the AAR and the American Academy of Religion, and Cameron Carter talked about his book, and then there was three of us who were responding, and my response was, if the history of René Descartes' descendants in their thinking, and on one level, sort of mainstream society in North America, they kind of don't really think about the land and about creation. They've got this. They're sort of their Christian faith is sort of very it's otherworldly. It's Jacques Ellul says it's kind of a form of escapism. And I said, and in your book, well, I had two criticisms. One, you just sort of absorb First Nations issues, which are different than some of the issues you're talking about. And I said, the other thing is that you get closer to the earth, but when you talk about a home, you're still, you still seem not to be talking about this land, like being connected to this land. It's about the Holy Land or the Promised Land, but it's this place. It's instead of it being here, this land, which Indigenous people, the land is like your relative. It's our mother. So that was just an observation I had. So, and then the other concern was that what exactly? Like, I like how you put it, Dalton. What's the end? Like, what is the end you're pushing for? Like, what exactly do you want? Because Indigenous people in Canada, they want to preserve the privilege of being who they were created to be, in connection with all things, harmony, seeking harmony. And but it seems like some groups, I'm sure that it's not what it seems like they just want to be a part of whatever there is, like they want their share. Am I making myself clear? Like, one of the things that makes a difference is First Nations, they believe that they have a right to self-determination. Not so much a right, but that's who they are, to be Indigenous people. And as far as other folks, if that's what they believe, they need to be who they are, whatever that may be, then I affirm that. But I'm sometimes concerned that, I don't know, is that what we're trying to do, or are we just we want our share? We just want to, that just sounds bad.
Yeah,
I'll be straight.
There is something about it's just that justice, or the end goal is a certain amount of who gets the throne, or who gets to call the shots, as opposed to there's got to be a more exciting thing worth working for and listening for, because it's painful.
Well, maybe this is a better way to put it. So,
it should be something good at the end that's better than just, well, we're going to divide this thing up equally, or something.
I don't want to run everything. I don't want to have dominion from sea to sea. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want it. And most First Nations groups that I meet with, they don't want that either. They want, though, to live in connection with the place where God put them. That place. That's who they are. To be Nishka or be Cree, that's to be who we are. That's treaty. And that's what's missing. Henry Nouwen talked about life signs. In a book called Life Signs, he said that he listed three things: intimacy, fecundity, and ecstasy. So fecundity is just fruitfulness. And I think that, to me, a just society was one where people were growing in their level of intimacy and solidarity with one another. So if that's what people are pushing for in justice, then yeah, that's a good thing. I agree. We should live in a society where people can be who they were created to be. Which is what Indigenous people, the reason they made treaty with the Europeans is because they thought the land was a good land, a big land, and that these people had come and they wanted a place to be who they were, and everyone thought, yeah, that's a good idea. But now I think people have something to gripe about when they don't get that right, especially African American community or African Canadian community or the Asian Canadian community. If they don't have a right to be who they are, that's not very good. Yeah. So they should be able to be who they were created to be. The little caveat I would ask is that it's through their relationship with Indigenous people that they can grow and be who the land will make them and teach them. So, which is a cool thing in Canada.
I think that aspect of a host culture is not something I've thought as deeply about as I should be. Like, I think it's starting to become a thing because people are addressing, starting gatherings, recognizing ancestral lands and things like that. So I guess that's starting. But hey, can I just take it to a real practical place, though?
Sure.
So some of the things that, for example, Indigenous communities face would be interactions with, like, police and, trying to get a job somewhere.
Yeah.
So a student, against all odds in some places, graduates high school, goes to university, and then struggles even to get a job there because, or whatever. There's all these things that are kind of stacked up against them just to participate and, like you say, to be a part, be who they're meant to be. We want to be a part of having, to be the agents, and I think the church has certain motivations for this, where we try as much as possible to remove those kinds of obstacles.
Right.
When you're talking with people in your community, because you're often and very frequently, and more sometimes I think than you're even, comfortable with, you're seen as a leader often, and they must come to you with some of those experiences and that's been years in the making, not just recently. Right. So what kind of things do you say to that in those situations?
I think that to me the thing that's missing in a lot of folks act out because they've never come to the place where they know that Jesus loves them and he really likes them. And the likes them part is really important. They have a religion that makes them do lots of stuff, but they've never come to the place where they understand that they're connected to all things and that they're responsible. So there's a sense of responsibility, but responsibility manifests itself as an opportunity every day to live in a new way. And
wow, that's really good.
To take responsibility and build on relationships that we find ourselves all around us. And that's what I learned from Indigenous folks, especially, folks who didn't have a lot. One of the things Elaine and I think we talked about this once, when we were, when I knew in Regina, we were making $24,000 a year, and we didn't have much, and yet we felt we didn't worry about stuff. And even we hung out with a lot of people who didn't have a lot of stuff, but there was intimacy and love, and if you asked for anything, people would give it to you and share everything. But as you start to get more economically, you get more stuff, you start to worry about it more. So Mark McDonald said once, that's why lots of times church leaders, religious leaders, they're worried about where everybody's going to sit and how they're going to feed everybody, and they miss the fact that Jesus is doing something cool right in front of them. So I talk to people how we need to you really need to understand that God loves you. That's why I still have an open, like, even though I work primarily with Anglicans, United Church, Presbyterians, I just think that the thing that A.B. Simpson found was that I think he probably discovered that God really did love them and he liked them too. And the fullness of that relationship. I think there's a ton of people out there who just struggle with that. They just don't believe it. So they all kind of distortions. And when it comes to people who suffered a lot, generational trauma, then these distortions, the way that we see God, one another, ourselves, they're amplified. And you need to help people find ways to see what is true and have someone tell them again and again and again, that this isn't true, don't you? And this is the truth, that you're beautiful, and when it comes to racism, so what has to happen is the really terrible thing about racism when it comes to Indigenous people, and in my own life, it's bad that people say things to me and stereotypes and treat, that's as bad as that is, and it is bad. It's not good. I'm not trying to let anybody off the hook. What's worse is that I believe those things about myself. I believe all the stereotypes, that I'm lazy, that I have to really stay after myself and push myself to do more because, I'm lazy. It's part of who I am. And all kinds of other stereotypes. And so I think a lot of suicide by young people happens probably a lot because of sexual abuse and because they believe that they are unlovable. And so as I get older, the more I do, I just try to help people see that God loves them and he likes them. And then I use the tools so one of the things I shifted was I actually talk about emotions, like what you're feeling, and then help people follow those, use those emotions to help us to heal. Because I think that's why God gave us emotions, to help us to heal. They're trying to heal us if we would just listen. That was a book. It's called The Language of Emotions. Your emotions are not trying to hurt you. They're trying to heal you if we could just hear what they're saying. And in one sense, there's this stuff about racism. A lot of men resist. They don't like to hear Black Lives Matter. They don't like to hear missing, murdered Indigenous women because it makes them feel something and they don't know what to do with that negative feeling. So typically what we do with negative feelings is we deny that they're there. We try to cover them up by using something, humor, scoff at them. But ultimately, I think one of the issues is we feel something and we don't know what to do with it. And we don't like to feel like that. We want to feel comfortable. So we pursue some other thing. That's what I think. So Pierre Allard, who used to be the head of the chaplaincy in Corrections Canada, he said 3 movements are involved in restorative justice. One, you got to tell the truth. So I think that's what's happening right now. We could use that framework to think about the protests and the things about racism. You got to tell the truth. That has to happen. And so people are telling the truth, which is a good thing. So if you can tell the truth in school curriculum, if you can tell the truth in the media, if you can use social, so you got to tell the truth. The challenge is if you push too hard, then you're going to short circuit the next part, which is you got to listen. Now, people can't just stop listening because they don't like hearing, but there is a point when you go too far. Like when we talk about the trauma of sexual abuse, we don't go into all the gory details because on one level, it doesn't help anything. If you're just doing it to glorify the act, like, it's just not helping. But if you can talk about it in a way that people can stay with you and feel the pain that happened to people when they endured those things that happened, that changes. You need to feel something. You need to listen and you need to feel, because if you don't feel, you won't actually feel. You won't have the emotional resources necessary to actually change. And then you have to come up with a shared plan, and that's the teaching part, which Walter Brueggemann talks about. He said, lots of people feel things. They go to maybe you go to a protest, you see something, and you realize, man, those people are getting the shit end of the stick. And you feel something, you feel the injustice, and you want to make a change. But he said you have to do some teaching and come up with, and I'm saying you have to, he doesn't say this, I'm saying this, you got to come up with a shared plan about how we're going to fix this. How are we going to fix this? That's what Donald Trump should have done down in the United States. He should have said, how are we going to fix this? This is not right. We got to fix this. How can we come together and fix this? You can't just vilify everybody who's doing that. Or you can't start to justify and say, it's not me, it's not me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, if you don't have to worry about proving your own innocence, then you're free to take responsibility for the sins of society and work to heal those things. And I like that. So when it came to First Nations issues, the residential schools, at first I noticed a lot of people just trying to say, well, that wasn't me. I'm not responsible for that. Which I always say, well, sure you are. Your government said you were. The Prime Minister of Canada and all the parties stood up and said, yes, we were guilty of trying to destroy Indigenous people through the residential schools, and they apologize. So in Canada, you can't say we didn't do it, because you said you did. You confessed it, and then you don't have to. I always say to people, you don't have to argue about whether you're guilty or not. Just, yes, we are. Let's just move on then to the next thing, which is, how do we fix this thing? But don't do it the way that men do it, right? Mike, just, how we do that sometimes with our spouses. Okay, yeah, I said, okay, how are we going to fix it then? Just don't be like that. But come up with a shared plan about how we're going to fix it. I know it's difficult. It's not easy. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission showed us that all these meetings and pages of reports and 94 calls to action, and it's not easy, but there's a clear plan of what to do to begin to restore and give back the dignity that society has taken from certain people groups, certain genders of people, and work to begin to heal.
This whole podcast thing that Mike and I are doing is moving to a new place. So it's the hope that as people listen to us and listen to our story and listen to some of our commentary, that they can hopefully, in one way, shape, or form, have a new understanding that they didn't have previously. So in your time, do you have any examples of people who you've met or organizations who, after, however many conversations, however many years that you've seen, that you could say, they actually have moved, their perspective and their understanding has shifted in a way that has,
Sure.
changed things?
I think we had a reconciliation gathering at Fort San with the board of directors of the Christian Missionary Alliance and the First Nations Alliance churches, the pastors and elders from those churches. And we had a reconciliation meeting. And I remember at one point I asked the chair of the board, I said, has society's attitude about First Nations people impacted the Christian Missionary Alliance, and have you treated us in a negative way because of how society looks at Indigenous people? And the chair said, yes, it has. Yes, it has. That was significant. And I said, because, how white people act has impacted how we think about you. And so we met there and we had this moment of reconciliation. And I think that a lot of the suspicion, at least on part of the Indigenous people, on my part then, maybe I'm just speaking about me, I can't speak for anybody else, but I know I was less suspicious and we were more upfront. For at least 2 years in the Christian Missionary Alliance, we talked about, for 2 years, relationship was important in the Christian Missionary Alliance. For 2 years it was. That was when they apologized for that residential school, that MK school. Right. They apologized for all kinds of things. For a couple of years, relationship and healing relationship was fundamental to the Christian Missionary Alliance. And some of that is still residual, but that shifted away. Because you have to maintain that, because the tendency in institutions is to shift back towards a utilitarian focus on doing stuff and away from relationship, which I always push, and I always used to say, look, relationship is the goal, it's the measure, and it's the means. And you guys keep thinking you're building something else. I don't know what you're thinking. So
how do you maintain it? How do you maintain it in your view?
Protocol, man. Protocol. Ceremony. The space between us is respect and honor. And we maintain that by protocol. We treat each other. We greet one another. We treat each other with dignity. We don't presume on others. I know it sounds silly. We have good manners. And we treat one another with respect and make room for people to be who they were created to be. One of the challenges that folks have in churches working with First Nations people, or with anybody who's different, is that space makes us feel uncomfortable in mainstream society, so they want to erase that space all the time. And that's when the paternalism comes in. And because they can't erase it, sometimes people get suspicious, they get pissed off, and they act out some of those things. And that's what happens. That's what all the strange things happen. So then, because the flip side of racism thing we never got into was paternalism. Most evangelical Christians in Canada are paternalistic at best when it comes to First Nations people. At best, they're paternalistic. And that's paternalism and racism are on the same continuum. Mm-hmm. They're on the same continuum. And it's all part of looking down on other people. Another place that there was significant change that happened was anytime, I remember we were doing Marriage Encounter in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Larry Wilson and I and some other folks, some Indigenous folks, we put on 4 marriage encounters. And sometimes there were non-Indigenous couples who would come, and we would minister to them. You'd have a big team of Indigenous people who would minister to these couples, some non-Indigenous. And I remember one couple, and a person from that couple came up to me, and they told me, I didn't know there was any kind of prejudice or anything in me, but I realized, because I've been ministered to by Indigenous people this whole weekend, and it melted something in me that I didn't even know was there, but I'm changed because they were ministered to by an Indigenous person, and it changed them. And that changes people. And then, sort of the United Church is a good example of an institution that changed. They do some great work towards, and they probably messed up a little bit, gone soft on the gospel at times, but they pursue justice and they work hard at it, and they do some good stuff to try to rectify some damage that's happened in the past. Salvation Army too, they did some change, they made some changes, and they took this seriously. The Anglican Church in Canada took it seriously. 2005 they began, they really just let it happen. The Anglican Indigenous Church, sort of self-determining, began to form, and they've gotten behind that with all they can. So there's a book called Alliances, and in it they said, there's three kinds of alliances that people have formed with Indigenous people. One is paternalistic, and one is sort of a shared task. You both have a task, so you focus on this, but you really don't come together other than the task. And the other is when a non-Indigenous organization or person, they just adopt the values of Indigenous people and they get behind what's going on. And that's another kind of alliance. So I think in cities, churches, there's been a prophetic voice gone out by the African American community and others, and have said, hey, there's all this stuff that's happened. They're telling the truth. Now's the chance for people to listen and sit down and begin to come up with a plan. How do we fix this? Because this is not the way that it should be.
In your eyes and in your vision and your prophetic imagination, if the Creator could sit all of us down together, not one side versus the other, but just collectively to sit us down, what would you think the Creator would be telling us right now in this time?
I think that, okay, I'll tell you a story. So Elijah Harper called the Sacred Assembly like in 1995 and in Ottawa. We met at the Palais de Congrès back then it was called Hull. Now I think they call it Gatineau, right? And we met to seek a spiritual solution for the enmity that existed between peoples in Canada, because we believed that we were the host people and that we were responsible for what was going on. And so we came together for several days. Jean Chrétien showed up, Lucienne Bouchard showed up, Brian Stiller made a statement at the end, and it was the fact that we committed to be agents of reconciliation. And we did that by first be reconciling with one another. And we said, let's continue to work to be agents of reconciliation. I think we've continued to do that as different individuals. And to do that, I think the Creator would sort of say, create spaces. First of all, you got to come together. You got to listen to each other. Listen. Tell the truth and listen to one another. And when you've done listening long enough, then come up with a plan.